All right, we're here to talk about clay at home and how to set up a friendly space for clay in your house. Something that I think a lot of people are either doing or thinking about doing. And I'm hoping to provide some helpful tips for that, whether you already have a studio space or a space you're working in your home with clay or you're thinking about it. We're just hoping to make it a really accessible, easy thing for people to figure out, regardless of the space they have, where it is, how big it is. Really want to encourage people to make it work. And I'll introduce myself. For those who don't know me, I'm Marisa, and I manage the ceramic studio and teach ceramics classes right now via Zoom for the Richmond Art Center. And we are located in Richmond, California. We've been closed, the facility's been closed since last March, and about June, we started doing virtual classes. So we're keeping that going and hoping that this video today will help a little bit with figuring out some of the particular challenges that using clay at home presents. So a couple of things we're going to cover as far as setup goes is work surface, what type of work surface, where you want your setup to be, wedging surfaces, storage and drying, water and how to manage your waste clay, recycling clay, health and safety, of course, and then some ideas for easy tool substitutions at home, things that if you're using a studio, the studio may have that you might not have, some substitutions for those things that are pretty cost effective. So any questions before we move into it? As I said, we really want this to be something that's helpful for people, whether they have a garage studio, are working in their basement, whether they have a studio separate from their home, or are working at their dining room table. So hopefully, whatever size space you have, it's something that can be adapted. And starting with the first question, I think you want to consider is what exactly are you going to be doing in this space? And it seems like an obvious question, but it's good to think through what type of clay work you're going to be doing. Are you hand building on a small scale, making bigger sculpture? Do you want a wheel in this space? Are you going to be glazing or underglazing in this space? Are you going to be slip casting? Do you need a lot of drying space, storage? Good to think through that whole scenario, and then you'll understand a little more about what makes sense for table surface and size and storage and all of that. And then the next thing I think to consider is how much is this space a part of your living space? So if you have the ability to make the space furthest away from where you spend the most time, that's probably ideal. If you have an outdoor shed or a garage space, I used to work in my basement, in a corner of my basement with my wheel, no sink, access to water was outside at a spigot, and I had a bucket system and made that all work. So it's kind of doable, whatever you've got. And now I do a lot of my decorating and underglazing at my kitchen table. So we'll talk more about safety considerations, but even if the space you're thinking about is part of your living space in a major way, there's ways to make that safe. And then another thing to think about is, do you have the ability to utilize any outside space? So is there a connecting outside space where you can do some of the messier stuff or the dustier stuff? related to clay, mixing, sanding, stuff like that. And it's always great if you have some outside space to use, but that might not be possible. So the first thing I want to get deep into is clay dust, because that's, I think, the thing on people's minds the most when they're thinking about using clay in their home. Clay dust and sink clogging. So as far as clay dust, when we're working with clay in the wet form, it doesn't pose any risk to our health. But when clay dries and we breathe in the dry bits, that's really not great. So keeping everything clean is the best way to avoid that, obviously, because wet clay, even a little bit of wet clay is going to dry into dust, and it's easy to, when it's in dust form, move it around and kick it around and drag it into other rooms that you aren't using for clay. So especially important to clean. One of my recommendations, if you are, say, hand building in a space like your living room, kitchen table, somewhere that you use a lot and you really want to keep very clean, would be to lay down some kind of plastic, heavy duty plastic or vinyl, and work on top of that. And then when you're done at the end of every work session, you can kind of roll that all up, take that outside, take it to your garbage can, dispose of it that way. So you're really keeping everything contained, as well as the cleaning of your tools, if that can be done outside or in a utility sink in the garage, something like that. That is ideal. And then for setup, another good thing to think about is where's your water and where's your power. So if you're setting up a real studio space, you want to consider electricity, the layout of your outlets. Do you have a sink? And if you're thinking about getting kilns, that's something where you want to call an electrician. But other things you might need to use outlets for, like heat guns, your wheel, think about that kind of stuff when you're considering the layout. And then water. So this is a major one. I think everyone's worried about getting clay in their sinks and their plumbing, as they should. And there's a few solutions. When I was using my garage to throw, I had a bucket system of several buckets that I could wash my dirtiest stuff in, take it to the next bucket, wash. So 2 or 3 buckets does the trick. If you have a hose, I had a spigot where I could get clean water. That's helpful. If you do have some kind of utility sink, there are things you can do to avoid clay getting in the plumbing. You could use the bucket system initially and then wash, clean stuff in the sink. You can also purchase or make a sink trap, a clay trap for your sink. And there's some YouTube videos about how to make that, and you can purchase them fairly inexpensively. So if you really want to go that far, as you're setting up a studio that you're going to continue to use, that might be a good investment. But the bucket system works really well, saves water, and the only challenge it might present is how to dispose of the clay. And so there's a few things to think about there too. Your first bucket is going to collect the most amount of clay, and that's going to settle down. So when you get a good amount of clay in there, you might want to pour off the clean water, let that clay dry out, and dispose of it in the trash. Clay is not a bad thing for, our yards necessarily. So if you have a little bit of clay, you might just be able to kind of have a dump area. The thing to think about there though, for example, I use a lot of colored clay, and the colored clay has uh, heavy metal colorants that we use in ceramics added to the clay. So that's something you definitely wouldn't want to be dumping in your vegetable garden or anywhere in your yard, because there's traces of heavy metal in there. So think about that. But just letting clay dry out, and then takes a while to accumulate, a lot of waste clay. Um, I don't usually recommend re-wedging the clay that comes off of your tools. It's kind of contaminated, not usually the best to wedge back into your recycled clay if you're recycling your clay. But definitely you'll want to have like a big container, a bucket or something where you can just dump your scraps and recycle that stuff into slip or re-wedge it into clay. And we'll talk about wedging in a bit. The other thing I think is good to think about as far as your space is light, and climate in the room, or in the room you're working in, and wherever you're storing your work. So do you have enough light to work? Obviously natural light is nice. And, if you have a yard where you can set up a folding table and work out there sometimes, that's great. And you would just want to, consider sun and wind and all of the things that could make it harder to work. And then climate, as far as storage goes, is really key. We all know how tricky it can be sometimes to get our clay at the right consistency for working. And so generally, if you have a cool space like a garage to work in or to store your work in, that's much better than, a warm, sunny room, because you can control how quickly things are drying. So you'll be able to control somewhat with plastic and wrapping or cheesecloth, which is great for keeping things equally moist. But definitely think about where you're storing your work. That can make a big difference. And we're fortunate in the Bay Area not to have to worry too much about it getting really cold or really hot or really dry. But use that to your advantage. One solution to work drying out too quickly, that is great for home use, is a damp box. And so for me, I just use like a Tupperware like this. And for small pieces, I might store them in here, give them a spray once in a while. I store my mixed colored clay in here so that it's less likely to dry out before I get to use it. But if you want to make something bigger, purchasing like a whatever size dimensions you need, but a bigger Tupperware that has a pretty good sealing lid, and you can pour plaster in the bottom. If you want to go to the trouble of mixing plaster and you feel like doing all that, you could also purchase pre-made pieces of plaster that you keep wet. And the idea is the plaster stays damp and it keeps everything in there damp, just like a little humidity box. You can omit the plaster and just spray things well, and that will work also. And there's a lot of information and videos out there about how to make your own little damp boxes. It's easy to do and inexpensive. And while we're talking about storage and drying, well, first, here's like a piece of plaster. You could either pour or you can buy some pre-made plaster like this at your local ceramic store, and you could put that in your damp box. It's also a helpful surface for other things. We'll talk about that in a second. And then canvas can be helpful, pieces of canvas to have around. As far as work surfaces, a lot of studios use canvas stapled to tables. You can do something like that. Your work surface is really going to depend on what you're doing. So basically, you want a surface that just isn't going to stick to the clay, is easy to wipe and clean, and can get wet. So it isn't going to warp when it gets wet. People use other materials like Formica or hardy backer board, that kind of stuff. And that is an option for your work surface as well. I often just work on, a piece of like heavy backed vinyl. And I like that because I'm working in porcelain and it doesn't dry out the clay as I'm working with it. So different surfaces are going to give you different, sort of absorb different levels of moisture from the clay. And that's a good thing to think about too. For storage and board things you can use, scraps of wood are good for storing your clay on. This is really absorbent. So if you put your pieces on this, it's going to suck the moisture out. So that's always something to think about. And less absorbent wood is helpful, as well as like masonite, as well as plastic. Like this is a plastic bat. That's what I'll store a lot of my work on when I really don't want it to dry out. And then another work surface that's nice is, this is like a piece of drywall and the edges have just been taped with duct tape so that it doesn't give off any powder. And it's nice to be able to work on something like this, a little board. It doesn't stick to the clay. You could also think about bigger boards. This could be your work surface or your wedging surface. And it's also really good if you're rolling slabs to wedge your clay or to dry your clay between two boards so that it really evenly dries. So those can be handy to have for various reasons too. Any questions about table surfaces or, yeah, Larry?
I was just looking at surfaces that are being used both for storage and for working. And when you raise the drywall, it occurred to me there are types of drywall that are water resistant. There's green board and blue boards for plaster work. And I was wondering, have you ever seen drywall used for the storage period when you're trying to get your piece to slowly dry?
Yeah, definitely for slabs. That's something, it's gonna wick away more moisture than like something plastic will. But yes, it could be used for drying and it could be used as a work surface and it could be used just as like, I'm working on this piece here and then I'm gonna move it onto something. So there's a lot of uses.
Is it important that it be a water resistant board if you're actually using it in the drying process?
I don't think it has to be, but the benefit of the water resistant board is it's not going to warp. And so I think if you have access to that, that's probably a better thing to purchase.
Thanks.
And yeah. But again, if you're going to cut pieces, always make sure you tape the edges of whatever type of material like this you're getting. But yeah, that's a cheap, accessible material you can get at hardware stores and comes in handy. Let's talk a little bit about wedging. So a wedging table is usually not something that people are going to be able to bring into their home, something studios have. If you don't have, the space to build a wedging table or store a wedging table, there's a lot of things you can use instead. A sturdy, heavy, probably bigger and thicker than this would be good, piece of plaster can work on a sturdy table. I used to wedge on vinyl on my garage floor, and I don't know that that's ideal, but that worked for me because I don't do a ton of wedging. So think about, are you wedging, you know, large amounts of clay, large pieces of clay? Then you really want to set up something that's more ergonomic. And I've done some research, and there's not a total consensus on how, like, the height of your wedging table. I've come across various things, some that say like the height of your fingertips down at your side, which is on the lower end, and some things I've read say more around like your hip bone. But it's good to think about because it really does make a difference, especially if you're doing a lot of wedging. And other options for wedging, I mean, the thing is that you really want something where the clay isn't going to stick. So plaster, canvas, and something where you can, you know, really sort of abuse the table a little bit because you're going to be pushing your body weight into it. So it's important that it be sturdy. Any questions about wedging surfaces, work surfaces, storage surfaces?
Yeah, Marisa. You know, when you're saying to put, like, say, a piece of plaster down on a table for wedging, it seems kind of like how do you keep it from moving, you know, when you're wedging? So that's tricky. I mean, I feel like we've got these big wedging tables in our studio, and then all of a sudden, like, wait, I'm trying to wedge on a piece of canvas on the table, and I've taped it to the table, and
Right.
it's kind of, it's just awkward. But I mean, I kind of like your idea of wedging on the ground. I mean, it does, you know, with knee pads, right?
Yeah,
But
it
still,
really
it's
worked
kinda,
well. It worked well for me, and you know, I was being careful that my body felt okay during that process. The ground is the sturdiest thing we could really wedge on. So if you don't have a sturdy table, that might be an option. If you have a big thick piece of plaster on a sturdy table and you've put something kind of under, maybe canvas, damp canvas, so that you can't move it easily, I think that can work. But you do need a sturdy table and a big piece of plaster if you're not going to be like pouring the plaster into the table. And there's definitely lots of information on how to do that, but it's a bigger process than, you know, a lot of people will be drawn to. I also really liked wedging on the floor because I wedged on a piece of vinyl, and again, when using porcelain, I really didn't want my clay to dry out that much. So when I wedged on the vinyl, it didn't absorb any of the moisture from the clay, and that worked well for me. But it's also good to have maybe a slab of plaster, even if it's just this big, to put your sloppy clay on if you need to dry it out. So even just a little piece of plaster that you purchase or pour is really helpful. And if you're pouring your own plaster, the best stuff to get is pottery plaster #1, which you can get on the internet or at your local ceramic store. And that's what people use for pouring plaster for hump and slump mold and slip casting. Okay.
So Marisa, this is Valerie. You covered, I guess, a bit of it when we were talking about storage and I guess creating a damp box, because that's a big concern I have with starting a studio in my garage, that in the summer it can get pretty hot in there, and I'm installing some metal storage cabinets, and I imagine that wouldn't be that great either. And so it sounds like even with the plastic box with the plaster, I probably should still bring items inside if I don't want it to be subject to extreme change, because it could get cold, but it could definitely get very hot in my garage.
Yeah,
so
and
I'm concerned about that. I think during the day, probably if I'm working in there, I might have the doors open, but still, you know.
Yeah, well, the really nice thing about working in your home is you're there and you can monitor what's happening. So if it's warm, if it's cold, you can adjust. If you're storing work that's kind of in progress, drying on a rack like that, that works. And you could even plastic kind of all the way around and just try and create, a little damp zone spray in there if it's getting too hot or dry. But I think if you're really wanting work to stay moist for a long period of time, the damp box is helpful. If you're able to keep in the flow of working and checking on it, then plastic and regular wrapping should work fine, unless it's really warm or dry. Claire, you shared something in the chat. Will you tell us what that is?
Yeah, I was just typing that up. It's a woman, she's actually in Ireland, but she shared her pots that she had thrown. They were smooth surface pots that she had put in her damp room, but they were pretty wet, she said. And when she went back in to check on them several days later, I guess the temperatures really plummeted. That's what they looked like. They were covered in these gorgeous snowflake patterns.
Wow.
All this ice on them. And I don't know if you can see it. I tried to post it in the chat, but they're absolutely gorgeous, and what you'd really want to, like a kind of texture you'd want to put on your pot. But once they melt, they'll be gone.
Oh, I
They're
see
pretty
it.
exquisite. Can you open it?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. They look
I
like
have not had that
snowflakes.
problem in California.
I don't see
No.
them.
If you click on the link that Claire put in the chat, you'll see it. But you could probably also Google frozen pot. And yeah, and mold is something that we encounter a lot on our pots also, which doesn't do any harm. But yeah, when people leave things here in the damp room for months, I often uncover them and there's various colors and textures of mold on them. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's good to make sure like air is circulating through your studio space. If you're noticing a lot of mold, that's probably not a great sign, but a little mold does not hurt. Any other questions at this point?
Marisa, this is Melanie. So is there any concern of like spraying diluted bleach on a pot that has a lot of mold on it?
That's a good question. I mean, you don't need to do that
Mhm.
because the mold will
There you go.
Fire off.
disappear. Yeah,
Yeah.
will fire off.
Yeah, I was just thinking because sometimes, I have some plaster bats that sometimes get moldy. And then that's what I do, just sort of clean those up. But thank you.
I have a thing for Valerie. Can you hear me? Can you hear Holly?
Yep.
You can't hear me. You can hear me?
Yeah,
I did the same thing with storage shelves, like iron, metal racks, and put a shower curtains around it so I can get into it. And then if it gets too dry, I have a little humidifier that I plug in, and that helps. Just keep it on low.
Good tip. Thank you.
that's a good tip. Yeah.
And Larry?
Yeah, just a quick note. Acids and bases change the way clay behaves, and acids in particular. So just, I don't think mold should be a concern, but I think adding acid to clay would potentially cause problems.
To the clay itself.
Yeah.
But what about vinegar? We're using vinegar when we kind of put handles and
It
things on
changes the way the
vessels.
clay behaves.
Yeah, and that's why
But-
we're using the vinegar, because in that case,
Right.
it's working to our advantage.
Right.
So I have some tool ideas I wanted to show. And let me just make sure we've gone through kind of the outline of studio stuff. I want to just sort of reiterate that anything really dusty or messy, anything involving powders of heavy metals, glazed colorants, powdered pigments, mason stains, that should all be used outside ideally, unless you have a really good like hooded vent that's made for that kind of thing. And so that's the biggest safety issue when working from clay at home, is the powdered materials. And you wouldn't want to do glaze mixing inside unless you had a real setup for all of that. But outside should work fine. And that's how I do a lot of my mixing with mason stains, is either outside or under a hood. Any questions before we move on to tools? So just bear with me for a moment. I brought some tools over that are common in a ceramic studio that you might not have access to at home. So we'll start with the banding wheel. And it's something that can really help if you're hand building at home. These small ones are really well made. They're not the cheapest. So you can get cheaper versions. Even those less expensive versions will be helpful for any type of hand building, particularly if you're working on a round vessel. But anything, sculptures, it's great to have something you can turn around like that. And you can buy a smaller version and just, if you have a bigger piece, just put a board on top as long as it's stable. You don't need to buy the biggest banding wheel. Some other tools that are helpful to have: a rolling pin. Most people don't have slab rollers in their homes or space for that. So rolling pins, and I actually prefer to roll my slabs by hand with rolling pins. Something that turns well and has a ball bearing is really helpful, but also you could, in a pinch, use any kind of wooden PVC pipe, even like thick cardboard in a pinch could help you roll something out. So you don't have to spend a lot of money on that type of thing. And then if you are rolling out slabs by hand, just an inexpensive way to ensure even thickness is, I don't know what to call these, but little rolling sticks, we'll call them. And then you can put your clay there and roll across those. So that's very helpful for hand rolling slabs. Some other tools that are helpful if you have something like a pony roller or paddles, and they sell nice wooden ceramic paddles, but you can use something like a rice paddle. You can use a lot of different things you might have in your home already. Of course, make it a dedicated clay tool. Things in your kitchen that could be helpful. And then it's also fun to kind of look around your house maybe and see what non-ceramic tools you might want to use. Combs, these are, I don't know what these are, but they're from a hobby store. Some plastic texturing tools, sculpting tools. You don't need a lot, something as simple as a skewer could be what you need. Ribs, so we often buy these metal, rubber, plastic, wood ribs for ceramics, but people, get creative and use old CDs I've seen people use for ribs, if people still have CDs around, and old cards, like old credit card type plastic. You can cut it to whatever shape you want. So that's an easy solution. Things for slicing like cheese, slicers. If you don't have a wire tool, using something like fishing line type wire could work. And I find a handy tool like a flexible ruler is really nice for ceramics. One thing that your studio might have that you don't have is a scale. We often weigh our clay, or if we're mixing ingredients for slips or glazes or whatever other materials, we'll use a scale. So you could purchase an inexpensive scale. Digital scales are probably the easiest, or if you have like an old, food scale, if it goes up enough. And then Melanie says dental floss works. Yeah. A spray bottle, that's going to come in handy. And last but not least, one way I like to store my slip, and you can see it has accumulated various colors of mold, that's okay, is in a mustard ketchup bottle like this. So I'll have my attaching slip in here, and it's really nice for application because you have this tip, but also it stays moist for a long time. If you knew you weren't going to use it for several months, you could cover it with a little bit of plastic wrap or something and seal it back up, or just tape over that. But that works really well for that. Another handy tool is the Sureform, and this one's made for ceramics, but you might have something like this, a tool for another material that will work the same way, and that's for shaving off clay. One of the best hand building tools. Any questions or tips anyone wants to share about inexpensive, accessible tools? Yeah, Melanie says for an inexpensive banding wheel, you could use a plastic Lazy Susan with a bat on top. Totally, that works.
I was going to say the Shimpo banding wheels are great because they spin so well and they're very heavy, but they're really hard to do detail work on because they move too easily. So a cheaper turntable is actually really good for doing hand modified work.
Right, and these are the more expensive Shimpo ones that are really nice because they turn, but can turn when you don't want them to. One more thing that just came to mind is how to launder clay related items like your apron or towels. It's a really good idea to hose that all down and get the clay off first, or if you let it dry out and you can pick the clay off. But again, clay in dry form, you want to just avoid that as much as possible. So if you can just hose it down and then put it in the machine to wash. And as far as cleaning up the surfaces, all you really need is a sponge. But if you've got a wheel or you're making bigger messes, a vacuum could come in handy, a little shop vac, a mop. But sweeping is not the best way to get your clay up off the ground or off the work surface because it spreads dust more than the other methods. So sponging is always kind of the best. I'm going to show one more tool, and this is my favorite tool to make at home, or even if you're not working at home. It's my favorite tool because I like it better, the homemade version, than the one you purchase. So we always need scoring tools, and we're gonna make one with just toothpicks and tape. But the reason I really like this better than the one you purchased is because the little pokies are closer together, and you can also make it as narrow or as wide by adjusting the number of toothpicks as suits you. So you could have one that's much wider, gets the scoring job done quicker, or a narrower one that can, you know, score just the lip of your pot or whatever. And we'll make one right now. It's very straightforward. On this one, I used some type of packing tape or just Scotch tape, but I'll use duct tape on this one. And then this one has 5 toothpicks. I like that, but maybe we'll do 6 on this one. Does anyone have any final questions or comments or tips they want to share?
I was going to say spatulas that you use for decorating cake that are like the broad, flat stainless steel ones I don't use it a whole lot, but I have one handy. You just never know. It could be used for a lot of different things working with clay.
Yeah, a lot of kitchen tools can come in handy that way. So.
And Jason always had a bent spoon and a bent fork in his kit.
So, yeah, fork is also a great scoring tool. I like this one because it's a little more delicate. You can get into areas. And that is as easy as it is. And as I said, I tend to use this one more than the ones you can purchase. I think it works better. Any other tips anyone wants to share, questions anyone has about anything we talked about?
And this is Valerie. I've been doing the hand building and that's worked out pretty okay, but I'm actually in the process of sort of adding a studio space in my garage so I can get a wheel. And I'm just curious as to anyone who's working on the wheel, one, what kind of wheel and what kind of tips they may have, or on tools, or even just general experience working at home on a wheel.
I can share mine, and then if anyone wants to share. So what kind of wheel really depends on your budget and your needs. I used an old, pretty crappy wheel that I got really used to and ended up liking. But my tip for setup, so I was in a garage that had a very major incline, and I found a way of getting a platform. I got a big wooden platform that I found that I could put and make it level. And then I covered that with a big piece of vinyl so that cleaning up was easier. The places where your clay tends to splatter in front of your wheel, to the side of your wheel, you can put something like vinyl or plastic there so that cleanup is easier and it's not getting all over your walls and floor. And I used that bucket system since I didn't have a sink with running water. I did have a spigot I could go get and fill up buckets, and that worked really well. Anyone else have setups, Larry?
Yeah, Valerie, I was going to say, I I had uneven surfaces, wall surfaces around my wheel. And so what I did was I bought cheap plexiglass panels. They're not that cheap actually, but because they're rigid, they just span the area of the wall that they were covering, and they were self-supporting, so I didn't have to pin them up or anything. And the fact that they're transparent or translucent means that you can see just how messy you are, and it prompts you to clean and wipe up a little bit more maybe. But for the floor surface, I just used a vinyl picnic tablecloth. They're very cheap. And I just laid it down on the floor, and the whole setup sits on top of that. It's very easy to clean up.
Thanks.
I-
Larry.
Hello? I use some of those, well, not Amazon, but Costco, when you buy stuff, they put them in those big cardboard boxes that fruit comes in. So I just take an X-Acto or, a box cutter and cut out a little area so that it sits right on top of the table of the wheel. So you have kind of an enclosure. And then if I'm really making a mess, I have a bigger box that folds up and I just slide it under something. And so I can just pull it out, put it back. I have a big table in there that I can just slide it under, and that works pretty well.
That's a creative solution. I love fruit boxes for carrying my work around too. Like
Right, me too, yeah.
Transporting your greenware. It's really handy.
I have a question about Marisa and to Larry. You guys both mentioned about vinyl on the ground. I don't totally understand. Like, you put your wheel on top of it, or and so then you're wiping it up with a sponge at the end. So because then the clay dust will still get up and around the edges, but not so bad. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have my tablecloth laid down on the ground. There are different weights you can use of vinyl. You can get roll vinyl that's fabric backed, that's very rigid and much sturdier. The cheap picnic tablecloth one tears eventually, and it's less permanent solution. But I lay it on the ground first and roll it up the walls slightly, and then when I put down my plastic panels, I had them on top of that, so that anything that runs down those plastic panels is contained by that vinyl. So if there is a little spillage, it goes under the table. It doesn't go out. It doesn't get underneath the vinyl.
Understood. Thank you.
And I'll just put a plug in for the Brent Wheel. I bought a used Brent Wheel. I spent about a year looking on Craigslist because I couldn't really afford a brand new wheel. And somebody was selling a wheel on Craigslist along with a ton of other pottery stuff that I got. And I think it might have been close to 20 years that this guy had the wheel. And I bought that wheel 20 years ago. And I've had some repairs done on it that were really inexpensive, easy, I just took them into the shop and it wasn't that big a deal. And I love that wheel. I just feel like it's an amazing workhorse.
Just a quick note about electric motors. The farther you are from the plug-in, the heavier gauge cord you want to use, you will wear out your motor. If you run it down like a light gauge cord that goes out 100 feet, you'll wear out your motor. So make sure you use the heaviest gauge cord for the longer runs.
Thanks, Larry. And Brents are great wheels. They're, heavy duty. Shimpos are a little less expensive. That's what we have in this studio. A lot of studios have either of those two brands. And the Shimpo Whisper is nice because it's quiet. So if that's something you want to consider. But like I said, I used a really old, I don't even know what brand it was, and eventually got used to it and it worked well. So you don't have to, it's good to check used wheels. A lot of people are purchasing wheels right now, so it might be harder than it usually is to come across one. Melanie?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, I did something similar to Claire, that I set up an alert on Craigslist for, you know, all of the brand names of pottery wheels. And I think it was maybe, I don't know that I waited quite a whole year, but I think it was probably more like 6 months. But I found it's a Laguna Pacifica. I definitely prefer the Shimpo Whispers at the rack. But I think probably because that's what I was using the most before I got my wheel. And I would say, I mean, it works fine. I feel like the pedal is a little bit touchy. Like there's kind of like a sweet spot that I have to find sometimes. But it's just sort of like with anything, the more you use it, you figure out how to use it best for your purposes. And so I highly recommend taking the time to find one used, if possible. I mean, if you have the funds to buy a new one, great, but like you could be using that extra money for like fun tools and like, you know, extra like fun ceramic stuff. So that's what I did.
Great. Yeah. We're going to wrap up here in a minute. Any other questions or comments?
Thanks for the feedback, everybody. That's very helpful.
And a lot of other ceramic tools, you know, wedging tables, extruders, slab rollers, things like that. If you have the space for them, look for them used. There's definitely people, you know, disassembling their studios, and so it's always worth a try. Wrapping up, I just wanted to say, if anyone who is here or who is watching the recording has any questions, please feel free to email me. My email is in the chat. And hoping that this is helpful for people who are wanting to work in any capacity at home. Maybe if you're thinking about taking an online ceramics class and haven't figured out how to make that work for yourself. You know, pretty much every studio is doing that model right now. And so the wonderful thing about this time is there's so much information sharing. We have access to studios across the country, across the world, teachers all over the place. So, you know, take advantage of what is a difficult situation right now. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you, Marisa.
Yeah, thank you. This has been great. Thanks.
Thanks.